Her smile won trophies. His voice melted radios. But when the cameras stopped, the real performances began, and they were far more twisted and violent than anyone imagined. 18 stars. One question: what happens when the most beloved faces hide the ugliest truths? Number 1. Bing Crosby. A father who preached discipline but left scars. His voice could calm a war-torn world. But for the children at his dinner table, silence was the safest sound. Bing Crosby was the golden voice of America. A velvet baritone wrapped in Christmas nostalgia, radio hits, and polished charm. He gave the country White Christmas. And for a time, it felt like he gave them hope. But behind the crooning smiles and soft-spoken interviews was a man whose own family remembers something far colder. To the public, Bing was a symbol of stability. A wholesome, pipe-smoking patriarch who stood for clean values and clean living. But his eldest son, Gary Crosby, told a much different story. In his memoir, Going My Own Way, Gary described their home as a place ruled not with love, but fear. Bing, he claimed, was distant, unforgiving, and harsh. He enforced discipline with what Gary called belts, razors, and fists, a reign of control disguised as parenting. Bing didn't deny being strict. He saw it as protecting his boys from the pitfalls of fame. But that protection came at a cost. He rarely showed affection, and according to Gary, berated them with insults about their weight, their posture, even their worth. "I was afraid of him all my life," Gary wrote, a sentence that lingers like an echo in an empty hallway. Some dismissed the claims as bitterness. Others, including family friends, quietly admitted they'd seen glimpses of Crosby's coldness firsthand. Still, many refused to believe that America's dad could have been anything less than perfect. The disconnect was too wide. How could the man who serenaded the nation with warmth bring such chill into his own home? And yet, the signs were always there. Bing was deeply private, emotionally sealed off, and haunted by the belief that indulgence would ruin his children. In trying to mold them into better men, he may have broken them instead. His son Lindsay died young, after years of struggling with his own demons. A tragedy many trace back to the unspoken wounds left behind. In the end, Bing Crosby died on a golf course. Quiet, composed, a legend intact. But to those who knew the truth, his greatest hit was also his cruelest irony. Even the warmest songs couldn't thaw the cold he left behind. Number 2. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler with a sinister edge. In 1938, he leapt onto the screen as Robin Hood, sword raised, smile blazing. A hero in tights who promised adventure with every line. But behind the cloak and charisma was a man Hollywood wanted you to love and quietly feared. Errol Flynn was the face of Golden Age escapism. With a devil-may-care grin and a voice dipped in velvet, he embodied the kind of leading man that made hearts flutter and ticket sales soar. Off-screen, he lived just as fast. Yachts, women, and champagne-fueled parties that burned long into the night. But underneath the bravado, something darker simmered. Flynn didn't just chase trouble, he collected it. From the earliest days of his fame, rumors circled, whispered accounts of wild nights, blurred boundaries, and behavior that left more than a few young women shaken. In 1942, 2 such women came forward, accusing Flynn of serious misconduct. The trial that followed wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a media circus, exposing the divide between Errol the icon and Errol the man. The jury acquitted him, but the stain never fully faded. While some fans refused to believe the allegations, others saw through the Hollywood polish. Insiders described him as manipulative, cruel when bored, and utterly indifferent to the emotional wreckage he left behind. He treated people, especially women, like props in his off-screen theater. If they cried, he called it melodrama. If they resisted, he called it misunderstanding. And yet, the roles kept coming. because Flynn looked like the hero, and in 1940s Hollywood, image often outweighed integrity. By the end of his life, his body was deteriorating. Years of excess, the bottle, the late nights, the constant thrill-chasing, had carved lines into his once boyish face. Friends said he looked like a ghost playing dress-up in his old roles, still flashing that grin, still pretending the world hadn't caught up to him. Errol Flynn died at 50. They say he collapsed with a drink in one hand and a joke on his lips. But the real punchline was this: he lived like the hero in a storybook, while turning other people's lives into tragedies. His grin lit up the screen, but it masked far darker urges no costume could cover. Number 3. Wallace Beery, Hollywood's kindly face, with a violent temper. To millions, he was the gruff but lovable uncle, the teddy bear with a booming laugh. But to the children who shared a soundstage with him, Wallace Beery was something else entirely. In the 1930s and 40s, Beery was one of MGM's most bankable stars. His face, square-jawed and familiar, appeared in films like The Champ and Treasure Island, always cast as the reluctant hero or grumpy protector who came around in the end. Audiences adored him. Studios gave him top billing, but behind that image was a man described by co-workers as short-tempered, cruel, and, at times, physically abusive. One of the most troubling accounts comes from a young Mickey Rooney, who appeared alongside Beery in Slave Ship, and later reflected on his volatile behavior. Rooney recalled being manhandled on set, not in character, but as punishment for upstaging the older actor. He didn't like being shown up, Rooney said. He'd grab you so hard you'd bruise. Even decades later, Rooney's words carried the sting of someone who had been forced to smile through pain. It wasn't just Rooney. Other child actors whispered of Beery's unpredictable moods, his disdain for younger talent, and his readiness to use physicality when words didn't satisfy his ego. Crews learned to tread lightly around him. Directors placated him. And the public, well, the public never knew. But perhaps the darkest cloud over Beery's legacy surrounds the mysterious death of vaudeville comedian Ted Healy in 1937. According to some Hollywood insiders, Healy was beaten in a nightclub altercation shortly before his death. And among the rumored participants was Wallace Beery. Officially, no charges were filed, and MGM quickly sent Beery on a vacation overseas. The timing was suspicious, the silence deafening, and though no verdict was ever rendered, the whispers never stopped. To his fans, Beery was the very picture of warmth. But for those who worked beside him, he was a different man, one who wielded his fame like a weapon, striking hardest when no one was looking. He died in 1949, surrounded by accolades and studio praise. But the truth lingered like smoke in a closed theater. The public saw a teddy bear. The cast saw something closer to a bully. Number 4. Joan Crawford, Mommy Dearest, wasn't just a movie. In 1945, she clutched her Oscar with trembling hands and thanked the Academy through carefully painted lips. Behind her smile stood a legend, and behind the legend, a daughter with a story the world wasn't ready to hear. Joan Crawford was the definition of screen presence, cold elegance, razor-sharp cheekbones, a voice like ice cracking under pressure. She wasn't just a star, she was a force. Whether playing a femme fatale or a long-suffering mother, she commanded the frame. But when the camera stopped rolling and the gowns came off, her most haunting performance may have taken place inside her own home. In 1978, 1 year after Crawford's death, her adopted daughter, Christina, shattered the silence with Mommy Dearest, a memoir that read more like a psychological horror film than a tribute. The allegations were blistering. According to Christina, Joan was controlling, violent, and obsessed with appearances to the point of mania. She described nights filled with screaming, harsh punishments over minor slights, and cold, calculated emotional games. And, of course, the now infamous scene involving wire hangers, which would burn itself into pop culture. Some dismissed it as a bitter daughter's revenge. Others, including her brother Christopher, quietly confirmed what Christina had written, calling their upbringing a constant state of fear. Studio executives, longtime friends, even staff members admitted they'd seen glimpses of Crawford's fury behind closed doors, a fury that clashed with her public image as a generous, devoted mother. That contrast is what stings the most. Crawford adopted 4 children and broadcasted it like a brand. Magazine spreads showed her decorating Christmas trees with them, feeding them soup in designer kitchens. But behind the curated snapshots, her need for control reportedly turned every relationship into a battlefield. Perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded, and love, when it came, was conditional. Still, Joan remained adored. Her funeral drew stars, tributes, and headlines filled with glamour. Christina was not invited. Hollywood remembered a queen, but her children remembered the cold of her footsteps in the hallway. Joan Crawford won an Oscar. She won hearts, but in the end, she lost something deeper. She lost the one thing even fame can't fabricate: her daughter's love forever. Number 5. Kirk Douglas, the idol with a trail of rumors. He played heroes with conviction. Spartacus, Vincent van Gogh, men who fought against the world with fire in their eyes. But when the lights dimmed, Kirk Douglas wasn't always fighting for justice. Sometimes he was just fighting for control. For decades, Douglas stood as a pillar of post-war Hollywood masculinity. Rugged, principled, passionate. He had the jawline of a warrior and the ambition of a general. But behind the accolades and the powerful roles, stories began to follow him. Quiet ones at first, the kind you only hear in studio hallways or whispered between those who'd worked too closely. Douglas was known to be intense. On set, he didn't just act, he demanded. He clashed with directors, fired a few, and was notorious for overriding creative choices if they didn't serve his vision. On Spartacus, he replaced the director within a week. On Paths of Glory, he clashed with Stanley Kubrick, trying to rewrite scenes mid-shoot. Some saw it as passion, others called it tyranny. But his most haunting legacy came not from his films, but from a long-buried rumor that surfaced after his death. In 2021, decades after actress Natalie Wood's passing, her sister publicly named Douglas as the man who allegedly harmed Natalie during her teenage years. The story had circulated in hushed tones for years, always implied, never confirmed. And now, with both Douglas and Wood gone, the truth may never fully surface. Douglas was never charged, and some still believe the allegation may have been misattributed or misunderstood. But the timing and the silence that followed cast a long shadow, especially given Hollywood's history of protecting its stars, no matter the cost. Off-screen, Douglas lived a life filled with extramarital affairs, admitted infidelities, and a need to dominate every room he entered. He once called himself the most unpopular man in Hollywood, and it wasn't entirely in jest. Beneath the surface of the myth, there was a man who pushed people too far, too often. He lived to be over 100, long enough to witness his own transformation from icon to question mark. Kirk Douglas built legends on screen, towering stories of rebellion, truth, and justice. But in his wake, he left something far less noble: a silence too loud to ignore, and shadows that won't quite fade. Number 6. Henry Fonda, the good American with a hollow home. In The Grapes of Wrath, he stood in the dust of the Depression and spoke for the common man. In 12 Angry Men, he was the lone voice of reason in a room clouded by bias. But in his own home, Henry Fonda often had nothing to say. He was the face of decency, the embodiment of stoic American virtue, cast in bronze and bathed in truth. Directors loved his quiet strength. Audiences trusted him. But to his children, Jane and Peter, he wasn't a hero. He was a stranger they spent a lifetime trying to reach. Behind the camera, Fonda was notoriously distant, emotionally frozen, reserved to a fault. Jane once said she couldn't remember a single moment of sustained eye contact from her father growing up. Peter described him as a silhouette in the hallway, more present in films than in family life. And when he was home, it wasn't peace he brought, it was silence. He was married 5 times. 4 ended in divorce. The 5th outlived him. His extramarital affairs were numerous and unrepentant, often with women just beginning their careers. Dazzled by his star power and seemingly unshakable calm. But calm, it turned out, is not the same as kind. Fonda didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike. He didn't rage. Instead, he withheld affection, support, approval. And sometimes that absence left deeper bruises than anger ever could. Jane once confessed that every man she fell for afterward was a subconscious attempt to win her father's attention. Peter, too, carried the weight, turning to rebellion before retreating inward. Their pain came through in their art. Jane's raw performances, Peter's poetic stillness. Both children found in film what they couldn't find at the dinner table, someone who listened. To the public, Henry Fonda was unwavering, a man who stood for fairness and decency when the world seemed to forget both. But as the years passed, it became clear he'd spent so long embodying those ideals on screen, he forgot to bring them home. He died with honors, respect, and a legacy etched into American cinema. But in the echo of that applause were 2 children still waiting for their father to say, "I see you." He stood for justice in the movies, but couldn't give warmth at home. Number 7. Milton Berle, the TV pioneer who crashed into chaos. He didn't just break into television, he was television. But by the time he returned to the spotlight, the only thing left to shatter was his legacy. In the 1950s, Milton Berle was more than a comedian. He was an institution. With a wink, a cigar, and a wardrobe full of slapstick disguises, Uncle Milty brought families together around flickering black and white screens. For a moment, his name was so synonymous with primetime that movie theaters adjusted their showtimes just to avoid competing with him. He was that powerful. But fame is a tricky thing. It doesn't always know when to leave, and neither did Milton. By the late 1970s, Berle's brand of humor, broad, brash, vaudevillian, had become a relic. So when Saturday Night Live, the edgy, youth-fueled comedy upstart, invited him to host in 1979, it was pitched as a tribute, a chance for the old guard to pass the torch. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. From the first rehearsal, Berle bulldozed the room. He rewrote sketches, ignored direction, and insisted on using his own outdated material. Cast members complained he mugged for the camera, interrupting scenes with exaggerated faces and stealing punchlines. Crew members said he barked orders like it was 1950. Worst of all, he reportedly demanded to close the show with a sentimental monologue, complete with spotlight and applause cues. Like he was back on Texaco Star Theater. The young cast was stunned. Lorne Michaels, the show's creator, was livid. He reportedly vowed that Berle's episode would never air again in reruns. And for years, it didn't. Behind the scenes, Berle was known for his titanic ego. He often steamrolled co-stars, insisted on top billing, and held grudges when he felt slighted. For decades, many tolerated it because he was Milton Berle, the pioneer, the legend. But when the laughter faded and the industry evolved, he couldn't evolve with it. His SNL appearance wasn't just awkward, it was a warning, a living symbol of how fame can curdle when it refuses to adapt. Milton Berle helped build the foundation of television. But when he returned to the house he built, he kicked down the door, tripped over the furniture, and blamed the audience for not laughing. He built the future of TV, then became its worst guest. Number 8. Peter Sellers, the clown who couldn't laugh at himself. He could become anyone, a bumbling detective, a scheming general, a mad scientist with 3 voices. But ask Peter Sellers who he was, and you'd find nothing but smoke and mirrors. In the 1960s, no one wore a character like Peter Sellers. He was dazzling in Dr. Strangelove, unforgettable in The Pink Panther, and mesmerizing in Being There. To audiences, he was comedy's chameleon, a genius of mimicry and timing. But those closest to him knew he didn't just play fractured men. He was one. Behind the laughter was a man in crisis. Sellers lived with deep mental instability, tormented by fears, compulsions, and an ever-tightening grip on control. He reportedly kept a shrine to his mother long after her passing and often claimed to feel her spiritual presence beside him. Some called it devotion. Others, quiet delusion. Directors often found him impossible to work with. Blake Edwards, who directed multiple Pink Panther films, described their collaborations as both brilliant and emotionally exhausting. Sellers would erupt without warning, one moment childlike, the next cruel. He would ghost rehearsals, rewrite scenes on a whim, and lash out if the spotlight strayed too far from his liking. During the party, he refused to speak directly with Edwards, choosing instead to communicate through assistants. Even while on set, his relationships fared no better. He cycled through 4 marriages, each one ending in heartbreak. Friends said he could be cold, manipulative, and utterly consumed with being adored, until he wasn't. One moment he'd shower you with praise. The next, he'd cut you out completely, sometimes without explanation. He was both the performer and the audience, and no one else quite made the cast. Sellers' inner chaos seeped into his body. He suffered multiple heart attacks, his health deteriorating under the weight of personal demons he could never fully name. Still, he kept working, trying to outrun the silence between roles. The silence that reminded him he was no longer pretending. Peter Sellers died in 1980 at just 54, a quiet exit for a man whose life was anything but. He made millions laugh, but when the curtain fell, there was no encore, only a mirror, cracked, flickering, and a man who couldn't recognize the face staring back. He made the world laugh, but never found peace in his own mind. Number 9. Mickey Rooney, the boy wonder who grew up bitter. He was the kid who had it all: the smile, the swagger, the studio's full attention. But as he aged, that glimmer faded, and what was left behind wasn't so easy to love. At his peak, Mickey Rooney was the most bankable star in America. The Andy Hardy series turned him into the poster boy for wholesome youth. The cheeky neighbor who always meant well. He had the world at his feet before he was old enough to order a drink. But the fame came fast, and so did the ego. And Mickey, it seemed, never stopped believing the spotlight owed him something. Behind the charm was a man critics and co-stars called abrasive, egotistical, and impossible to work with. He demanded attention like oxygen, and reacted harshly when the room didn't revolve around him. During National Velvet, insiders whispered about his treatment of a young Elizabeth Taylor, dismissive, condescending, and jealous of her rising fame. Years later, when asked about her, he waved her off as entitled and not that talented. That bitterness didn't come from nowhere. It came from a star who never learned how to share the stage. Rooney's off-camera life was a minefield. He married 8 times, some unions ending in scandal, others in betrayal. He burned through money as quickly as he earned it. And by the 1960s, the boy wonder was bankrupt, both financially and emotionally. His relationships were littered with accusations of mistreatment, both verbal and emotional, and his reputation for arrogance followed him from set to set. One of the darkest stains on his legacy came from Breakfast at Tiffany's, where Rooney portrayed an exaggerated, stereotyped caricature of an Asian landlord. Today, the performance is widely condemned as offensive, a tone-deaf relic of Hollywood's worst habits. But even back then, some found it troubling. Mickey didn't. He brushed off the backlash, laughing louder than anyone else in the room. The tragedy of Mickey Rooney isn't that he lost his fame. It's that he couldn't grow with it. He remained trapped in the role of the precocious kid. Even as the world moved on, He kept swinging for the spotlight, but somewhere along the way, he forgot what it meant to actually shine. He played the sweetheart. But behind the grin was a man hardened by resentment, ruined by entitlement, a boy wonder who grew up bitter. Number 10. Fay Dunaway, the diva who crossed the line. In Network, she played a ruthless television executive clawing for power. Icy, brilliant, unforgettable. Off-screen, that performance wasn't entirely an act. Fay Dunaway was magnetic. From Bonnie and Clyde to Chinatown, the camera adored her, and so did the critics. She moved like she knew something no one else in the room did, and her presence lingered long after the credits rolled. But for those who worked with her, that mystique often curdled into something far less poetic: chaos. Behind the glamour was a trail of headlines and hushed conversations, stories of tantrums, of screaming matches, of hands that didn't stop at slamming a door. On more than one occasion, co-stars claimed Dunaway blurred the line between performance and punishment. During a stage production in the 1990s, she famously slapped an actor for real during a scene, leaving more than just a stinging cheek. The slap wasn't choreographed. It wasn't even necessary. But for Fay, it seemed control was the role she played best. Crew members described working with her as walking on glass. One Broadway wig designer recalled her erupting over the placement of a hairpin, striking an assistant's hand in a moment of fury. Others whispered about erratic behavior, including strange hygiene habits and a fierce resistance to basic on-set etiquette. On the set of Chinatown, director Roman Polanski allegedly clashed with her so severely that she once threw a cup of liquid at him, rumored, though unconfirmed, to be something more than water. Even her peers took notice. James Woods called her the most difficult co-star I've ever had, and Bette Davis, no stranger to diva behavior herself, once replied, "Fay Dunaway," when asked who the most challenging actress in Hollywood was. The tragedy isn't just the temperament. It's what it overshadowed. Dunaway had a gift, a rare, searing talent that could have carried her even further. But too often, the memory of her brilliance has been eclipsed by the wreckage left behind after the director yelled, "Cut." She was born for the lens. But off-screen, the lights were harder to manage. And the applause, much harder to earn. The camera adored her, but her castmates? They were too busy dodging her fury to notice the performance. Number 11. Gary Crosby, Legacy of Trauma. The house was filled with music, radio hits, golden records, and the unmistakable voice of Bing Crosby echoing through polished halls. But for his son, Gary, the sound of applause was never louder than the silence at home. Gary Crosby was born into legend. His father wasn't just a star, he was the star. Bing Crosby, America's crooner-in-chief, whose voice softened wartime wounds and warmed Christmases for generations. To the world, Bing was gentle, wholesome, reliable, but behind closed doors, Gary knew another version, one the world wasn't ready to hear. In 1983, Gary published Going My Own Way, a memoir that shattered the illusion. It wasn't a takedown, it was a confession. Raw, pained, and aching with the kind of honesty children are often punished for speaking. In the book, Gary described a childhood not of comfort, but of control. Bing, he claimed, was cold, verbally cruel, and physically punishing. Praise was scarce, hugs were rarer, and in a home built on discipline, love was conditional. Gary remembered being mocked for his weight, belittled for his efforts, and told, in so many words, that nothing he did was good enough. "I hated my father," he once said in an interview, "because I feared him, and I feared him because I never knew when I'd fail him next." Critics at the time accused Gary of exploiting his father's fame. But behind the controversy, others quietly acknowledged, this wasn't just gossip, it was grief. A child trying, decades later, to make sense of wounds that never properly healed. His brother Lindsay, too, battled personal demons until his tragic early death, a loss many connected back to the emotional toll of their upbringing. Gary tried to make a name for himself, singing, acting, carving a space beyond his father's long shadow. But it was that same shadow he could never outrun. No matter how far he went, the world only saw Bing's boy, and beneath that legacy, the pressure simmered. In the end, Gary Crosby didn't want revenge. He wanted recognition, not for himself, but for the truth. That fame may build an empire, but inside the palace, a child can still feel like a prisoner. The microphones captured Bing's voice, but Gary's pain? That stayed off the record until it finally couldn't. Number 12. Orson Welles, Genius with a Cruel Tongue. In 1941, he changed cinema forever with Citizen Kane. But for all the truth his camera captured, Orson Welles rarely spared any for himself. He was a wunderkind, a prodigy, a man whose brilliance lit up the screen before he was old enough to order wine with dinner. Welles had the kind of intellect that made studios nervous. He spoke in monologues, moved like a stage actor even off stage, and made directors feel like understudies. The world called him a genius, and he agreed. But genius, unchecked, can rot from within. In private, Welles carried a tongue sharper than any of his scripts. Recordings of candid conversations with director Henry Jaglom, uncovered years after Welles's death, revealed a man who wielded contempt like a weapon. He called Bette Davis unwatchable, dismissed Laurence Olivier as dim, and referred to Charlie Chaplin, one of Hollywood's founding legends, as a petty narcissist. Even Spencer Tracy, the actor's actor, wasn't safe. Welles brushed him off as a second-rate presence. For many, it wasn't just ego, it was cruelty. He didn't just criticize, he scorched. Collaborators often spoke of working with Welles as both awe-inspiring and emotionally punishing. He demanded absolute control, second-guessed editors, alienated producers, and feuded with studio heads until doors began quietly closing. He was the kind of artist who burned bridges before the cement dried. Even his most brilliant works, the magnificent Ambersons, Touch of Evil, came shackled with stories of sabotage, isolation, and arguments that never healed. Yet beneath the arrogance was a hunger for approval that never arrived. As younger talents rose and Hollywood moved on, Welles grew bitter, more recluse than rebel. He struggled to fund projects, to finish the grand visions he'd once summoned on command. He blamed others, but some say he knew. The genius who once filmed shadows became a man haunted by his own. He died in 1985, still mythologized, and still misunderstood. Orson Welles could see more through a lens than most could, with both eyes open. But for all his cinematic truth-telling, it was his mouth, not his movies, that did the deepest damage. His camera revealed what others feared. Number 13. Judy Garland, Hollywood's most tragic product. She followed the yellow brick road into cinematic immortality. Ruby slippers, twinkling eyes, and a voice that could break your heart in half. But behind the curtain, there was no wizard, just a machine that chewed her up before she was old enough to vote. Judy Garland was never meant to be ordinary. From the moment she opened her mouth, studios saw dollar signs. MGM swept her into their system as a teenager, packaging her into America's sweetheart. But to fit the mold, they reshaped her with cruelty, control, and chemicals. She was too round, they said, too emotional, too much, so they told her when to sleep, what to eat, and what to swallow to keep performing. Long before adulthood, Judy's days were built on pills. One to wake her up, one to suppress her appetite, another to help her sleep. Rest was rationed. Emotions were unwelcome. She wasn't nurtured. She was manufactured. Her handlers monitored her every move, tightening their grip whenever her spirit started to show. The emotional toll came quickly. Judy began to unravel under the pressure, battling exhaustion, insecurity, and isolation. Her relationships crumbled. Her finances spiraled. She tried to assert control, but by then, the damage had calcified. the world saw her as Dorothy forever, frozen in time, while Judy herself was aging, hurting, and quietly falling apart. Studios knew she was struggling. They just didn't care, not as long as the curtain rose on cue. And when she could no longer meet their demands, they discarded her like a broken instrument. The Wizard of Oz made her a household name. But in the years that followed, the spotlight flickered, the applause grew faint, and the very voice that once soared began to tremble. Garland never stopped performing. Even in her final years, she toured small clubs, singing for crowds that still adored her, even if they didn't understand what it cost. She died at 47, alone in a rented London apartment, her body giving out after a lifetime of torment, dressed up as show business. Judy Garland wasn't evil. She was a warning, a girl sold as a dream and broken in the process. She sang about rainbows, but offstage, she was drowning behind the curtain. Number 14. Tyrone Power, the leading man who led two lives. In 1940, his face lit up Times Square. Sword drawn, smile gleaming, every inch the perfect swashbuckling hero. But for Tyrone Power, the real performance began when the cameras stopped rolling. He was Hollywood's golden hunk, impossibly handsome, effortlessly charming, and box office gold. Films like The Mark of Zorro and Blood and Sand made him a matinee idol, a dreamboat in Technicolor. Women adored him, men envied him. But behind that dashing image was a man tangled in secrecy, control, and contradiction. Power's personal life was a revolving door of whispers and half-truths. He married 3 times, each relationship dogged by rumors of manipulation, emotional detachment, and unspoken desires. He reportedly had affairs with both men and women, a fact carefully hidden behind the studio's iron curtain of image control. In a town obsessed with illusion, Power played the role of devoted husband and leading man, even when reality didn't match the script. Friends and insiders later spoke of a double life, of fleeting romances that ended abruptly, of partners, both male and female, left confused, discarded, or quietly paid off. Nothing was ever proven, but the rumors never stopped circling, and Power, who often said little about anything personal, never offered clarity, whether out of fear, pride, or obligation. He let the mystery grow. He wasn't cruel in the way others on this list were, but that doesn't mean there was no harm. Emotional damage doesn't always come from a raised voice. Sometimes it's the silence, the evasiveness, the feeling of being used for comfort in private, then erased in public. Those closest to him often described him as distant, careful, and relentlessly controlled, a man who lived like he was always on the edge of exposure. Power died young, just 44, collapsing on set while filming a sword fight for Solomon and Sheba. In a cruel twist of irony, the man who'd made a career swinging blades on screen was felled not by an enemy, but by the weight of what he carried inside. He starred in fantasies, swashbucklers, grand epics, but he never escaped the role he kept hidden, a man trapped between 2 lives and never fully safe in either. He led with a smile, but behind it was a sword he never put down. Number 15. Charlie Chaplin. The comedic genius with a disturbing taste. He made the world laugh without saying a word. A silent clown with soulful eyes and a wobbling cane. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Charlie Chaplin's silence took on a much darker tone. By the time he reached his later years, Chaplin was no longer just a comic genius. He was a global icon. The man who gave us The Tramp had become a living monument to early cinema. But with that towering legacy came an unsettling truth. Chaplin was revered on screen and quietly resented behind it. He was known for absolute control, not just over his art, but over the people who helped create it. On set, Chaplin didn't direct with collaboration. He dictated. Female co-stars, in particular, bore the weight of his perfectionism, often enduring dozens of takes while he picked apart their expressions, their movements, even their posture, not for the sake of the story, but to mold them into what he believed they should be. Actress Virginia Cherrill, who starred opposite Chaplin in City Lights, once revealed she was fired mid-production for speaking up about his treatment. He later rehired her, not out of grace, but because he realized replacing her would cost more. The message was clear. Your voice is expendable. Your value ends at the edge of my vision. Chaplin blurred the lines between mentor, manipulator, and master. He reportedly isolated his leading ladies during production, limiting their interactions with others and shaping their performances through control rather than direction. Critics now look back and see emotional coercion disguised as artistic brilliance, a pattern that left many women silenced while the world cheered. Even as Chaplin aged into global respectability, those closest to his productions never forgot the imbalance. The man who once danced with bread rolls on screen was, in private, a tyrant, with a camera, using charm when it suited him, and cruelty when it didn't. He lived long enough to be honored, knighted, and revered. But some legacies come wrapped in gold and stained in silence. Charlie Chaplin brought joy to millions. That much is true. But behind the bowler hat and the grin, there was a man who demanded obedience and erased dissent. He built a world without dialogue, then used that silence to his advantage. Number 16. Rex Harrison, My Fair Tyrant. In My Fair Lady, he taught a flower girl how to speak with grace. Off-screen, Rex Harrison was the one who couldn't hold his tongue. Known for his crisp diction and charming sneer, Harrison brought Professor Henry Higgins to life, with sharp wit and simmering arrogance. But behind the theatrical applause was a man whose real-life ego made the role feel less like acting and more like autobiography. Co-stars described him as cold, dismissive, and emotionally punishing. A man who didn't shout, but sliced. He had a way of making his colleagues feel small without ever raising his voice. If something wasn't to his liking, he'd let you know. Not with direction, but with contempt. Actress Julie Andrews, despite being early in her career during My Fair Lady's stage run, endured Harrison's aloof cruelty and calculated snubs. He didn't scream. He undermined. On set, he demanded deference and took offense when denied it. Off set, his marriages collapsed under the weight of betrayal and egotism. He was unfaithful to nearly every woman who stood by him. Each affair wrapped in justification, each apology delivered too late, if at all. One of his wives, actress Kay Kendall, died tragically young. Harrison had hidden her diagnosis from her, allegedly under the belief it would spare her, but the secrecy left her isolated in her final days. Even his good intentions carried the sting of control. Crew members often joked that working with Harrison required both patience and armor, but to the audience, none of that was visible. He was Higgins. He was Caesar. He was the voice of class and command, the man who lectured on etiquette while breaking hearts with the same mouth. Harrison continued to work into old age, still sharp, still sardonic, never quite answering for the emotional damage left in his wake. Unlike others, he didn't spiral into scandal. He simply outlasted it, wrapped in his own legend, untouched by the pain he caused. He sang about manners. He monologued about refinement. But when the curtain dropped, Rex Harrison proved that knowing how to speak doesn't mean knowing when to stop. He played a man sculpting others into perfection, while leaving those closest to him in pieces. Number 17. Joan Fontaine and Olivia de Havilland, toxic sisters. They were born just 15 months apart. 2 girls, 1 legacy, and a lifetime of cold shoulders. Joan Fontaine and Olivia de Havilland weren't just Hollywood royalty. They were sisters raised under the same roof, fed by the same hand, and destined to tear each other down. What began as childhood rivalry evolved into one of the most bitter public feuds in Golden Age history. And unlike the movies, this story had no graceful ending. Their mother, a controlling figure with favorites, allegedly fueled the flames early on, favoring Olivia while Joan clawed for approval. The resentment festered, By the time they both reached Hollywood, it was no longer about sibling affection. It was war. In 1942, Joan won the Oscar for Suspicion, beating her own sister, who had been nominated the same year. Olivia reportedly offered a cold congratulations. Later, when she won for To Each His Own, Joan returned the favor by turning her back. The pettiness became legend. They didn't attend each other's weddings. They skipped funerals. At one point, Olivia allegedly blocked Joan from seeing their dying mother. Joan responded with silence, then, years later, published a memoir detailing their icy history, laced with bitterness and blame. Hollywood adored it. The tabloids framed them as the feuding sisters, building an entire mythology around their contempt. But underneath the headlines was something much darker, a portrait of two women slowly losing the one person who might have understood them best. And that's the tragedy. They weren't monsters. They were human, hurt, hardened, proud. They lived long lives, both into their 90s, but never found peace together. Each went to the grave with the feud unresolved, like a thread never tied, a curtain never drawn. They dazzled audiences with elegance and poise, yet couldn't speak to each other without venom. They were celebrated for their portrayals of love and resilience, even as their own bond rotted beneath the surface. Joan and Olivia proved that fame doesn't fix what festers at home, that envy can outlive even blood, and that sometimes the deepest wounds are carved at the dinner table, not the casting call. Number 18. Charles Boyer, suave on screen, brutal behind it. He made a career out of whispering love in the dark. But behind closed doors, Charles Boyer's romances weren't whispered. They were walled in to the world. Boyer was the quintessential French gentleman. Smooth, unbothered, deeply romantic. The kind of man who could melt tension with a glance. In Gaslight, Algiers, and a dozen other swooning roles, he was elegance embodied. But the man behind the mystique lived a life of torment, and sometimes passed it on to others. Those close to him described a possessiveness that didn't align with the charm on screen. He was fiercely jealous, not just of other men, but of time, space, and anything that distracted his partner's attention. His long marriage to British actress Pat Patterson was held up as a rare Hollywood love story. But it wasn't without darkness. Friends whispered of emotional pressure, manipulation, masked as devotion, and a loneliness that crept into Patterson's later years, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from being consumed. When their son tragically passed at just 21, the grief wrapped around Boyer like a chain. He stopped smiling in public, stopped showing up to gatherings. His performances grew colder, more hollow, as if he were acting through a fog. But it was Pat's eventual illness that truly broke him. For over 4 decades, she had been his anchor. When she died, he unraveled completely. Just 2 days later, Charles followed her, unable or unwilling to face the world without her in it. Hollywood mourned him as a hopeless romantic, but the truth was far murkier. The same man who held women's hands on screen allegedly tightened his grip behind the scenes. He gave the world fantasy while living in private ruin. His tragedy wasn't just in how it ended. It was in the illusion he built and how desperately he clung to it. How he played love like a melody and lived it like a cage. Charles Boyer's voice could make you swoon, but listen closely, and you might hear the sound of control, disguised as a serenade. He didn't just act in dramas, he lived one, and not everyone walked away untouched. They gave us beauty, brilliance, and sometimes deep and lasting pain. For every role we adored, there was a version of them the world wasn't meant to see. History remembers the legends, but the truth remembers everyone else. If these stories moved you, subscribe to help us keep them alive. Like, comment, and share your thoughts below, because even the past deserves to be heard.